Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to start the second half of our panel. I don't believe in long introductions because almost every one of our speakers has a very distinguished career. But rather, I do tell occasionally some personal information. And so, if I get shot before I get out of the way of the speakers, you know I hit a sore spot. But in all honesty, it is always great to be able to introduce your friends to an audience. And my dear friend, we call each other brothers, and I should call him my little brother because he's 9 months younger than me. But I wouldn't really ever do that to embarrass him or anything like that. But this is Noel Martin Giesecke. He is one of the extraordinary cardiac anesthesiologists of our generation, and he is going to talk to us today on Arthur Keats and the heart of the matter. Without further ado, Marty.
We're in Texas, and I'll remind you that the sign on the front of this convention center only makes it illegal to carry an opened visual firearm into here. So
I better duck now.
all right, so I'm gonna breeze through these pretty quickly. I've got a bunch of slides. I want to thank you guys all, the Wood Library Museum, the ASA, Melissa, Doug, thank you for considering me for this. I don't have any disclosures. I want to do a couple of acknowledgments real quick. So most of the information about Arthur Keats is based on this article that John Cooper and I just published in the Texas Heart Institute Journal, June of this year, I believe. And that's online if you want to see it. The photos are an amalgam of images from the Texas Heart Institute, from Baylor College of Medicine, and then I also had 2 conversations with Steve Slogoff recently just to back up my memory. So the objectives are here. I want you to learn a little bit about these 2 physicians who played such a big part in my career. And I'm going to discuss, if we have time, and that's why I want to fly through the first part, what I thought were 4 impactful articles that came out of their collaboration together back when Steve was still working at Texas Heart Institute. So here's Arthur. Arthur was born in New Brunswick. He was a graduate of Rutgers University. He went to University of Pennsylvania Medical School. We heard about University of Pennsylvania Medical School in other talks earlier today. He interned at the University of Chicago, and from 1948 to 51, he was an anesthesiology resident and then a clinical research trainee at Harvard University Hospital and Massachusetts General Hospital under Henry Beecher, and that will become important here for a minute. After finishing his training, he went to practice general anesthesia in Switzerland, and he then returned to the United States, and from 1952 to 55 was chief of anesthesia at the Mary Imogene Bassett Hospital in Cooperstown, New York. He had a clinical instructor appointment at NYU. So this is 1955 when he finished there. Let's go back a year. So in 1954, Michael DeBakey, who we had comments on or mention of earlier in this session, he was looking for a new chairman of the department. It was actually a division of anesthesiology at Baylor College of Medicine. He only knew one anesthesiologist, and that was Henry Beecher, and so he reached out to Henry Beecher, and Beecher's only suggestion was Arthur Keats. So Arthur Keats became the founding chair of anesthesiology at Baylor College of Medicine on September 30th, 1955. And though DeBakey hired him, Arthur became more associated with Denton Cooley, both clinically and via research, because he did a lot of the research on the early means of cardiopulmonary bypass. He was personally involved, so he did almost every single one of Dr. Cooley's cases from 1956 through the early 1960s. As this slide said, he had anesthesiology residents helping him, and Jane Telford, who was a colleague in the department, would come over from Ben Taub Hospital to give him a lunch break most days. In June of 1965, Arthur started what was likely the first formal cardiovascular anesthesiology fellowship in the world. There's maybe some challenges to that, but that is our belief. And the first fellow was Cornelia Luchbahn. She completed her anesthesia residency at Boston City Hospital. The second fellow was a person that John and I worked with for many years at Texas Heart, Camel Gerges, and he became the fellow in 1966. There was no anesthesia residency at UT at the time because UT in Houston did not exist, but he had done his anesthesia residency at MD Anderson. It's interesting that in 1974, Arthur Keats was removed as chairman of Baylor College of Medicine by Michael DeBakey. I think it happened primarily because Arthur was continuing to work clinically with Denton Cooley at Texas Heart Institute and not so much with DeBakey or his immediate surgical colleagues at Methodist Hospital. And Cooley himself had resigned from Baylor College of Medicine in 1969 after a disagreement with Dr. DeBakey. And this all had to do with Cooley implanting the total artificial heart that was developed by Domingo Leota, who was an Argentinian physician who was working in the lab there at Methodist. And Domingo Leota felt that DeBakey wasn't giving him an opportunity to use his total artificial heart. He didn't think it was ready yet. Cooley thought it was ready. While DeBakey was out of town, Cooley implanted Leola's total artificial heart in a patient, Haskell Karp, that's in the news, Karp with a K. He couldn't be weaned from cardiopulmonary bypass. Keats did the anesthesia for that case. The total artificial heart worked well, and a subsequent heart transplant was done on that patient 2 days later. When Keats was removed as chairman at Baylor College of Medicine, then he went ahead and resigned his professorship there. He talked to Cooley and said, what do you think I should do? Cooley didn't tell him what to do, but said, you know, all your clinical work is over here. We're going to make it happen for you. We'll make it work out. And so that's what happened. So he became full-time at Texas Heart Institute. He set up a private practice anesthesiology group there in a private hospital, St. Luke's Episcopal Hospital, to provide CV anesthesia in an academic setting at Texas Heart Institute. For more than 30 years, along with Jane Telford, Alexander Romanoli, and others in his group, Arthur was a prolific investigator in the pharmacology of opioids and opioid antagonists. And these publications led to his appointments at the National Institutes of Health Surgical Study section and on the editorial boards of the Journal of Pharmacology and Anesthesiology. He was an editor-in-chief of anesthesiology from 1970 to 1973. His tenure on the editorial board was 1963 to 73. And he was also appointed as a director of the American Board of Anesthesiology from 1975 to 1987. He gave our group here, our society's Rovenstein lecture in 1983. And he hired me in 1991. The contract was a piece of yellow notebook paper. There were 6 handwritten lines on it. I wish I had access to that now to show that to you. And he posthumously received the Texas Society of Anesthesiologists Distinguished Service Award in 2014. Into Arthur Keats' orbit came Steve Slogoff. Steve was born in Philadelphia in 1942. His father died when he was 11 years old, and he leaned on a couple of early mentors in his life. The first of those was a great uncle on his mother's side who was a pediatrician and obviously therefore a physician. And he had a 9th grade biology teacher that really influenced him. He graduated from Franklin and Marshall College, and 1964, he really enjoyed playing intramural sports, flag football and basketball. Now, Steve's a real short person, so you can imagine his basketball success. He enjoyed it. I also tried to play basketball when I was young. Steve Slogoff went to Thomas Jefferson Medical School. He graduated in 1967. He was an intern at Harrisburg General Hospital in Pennsylvania in 1968. I mentioned this here because while there, he diagnosed and treated a young woman, I think she was in her late 30s, early 40s, who had an acute myocardial infarction. It was relatively unseen and undiagnosed in women back in those days. During his anesthesiology residency at Thomas Jefferson, which he finished in 1970, he gave anesthesia for the very first coronary artery bypass graft surgery in Philadelphia in the first year of his residency. And it was because the patient was this very same woman who came there to have surgery. When she found out he was working there, she said, "He's the only person I trust to give me my anesthesia." So Steve did that. He stayed on there to do his cardiovascular anesthesia fellowship, and he was the ABA #1 certificate holder in 1971 for the cardiovascular anesthesiology fellowship. His fellowship director, interestingly, was a surgeon, because at that time that he became a fellow, the anesthesiologist who was supposed to be his fellowship director had left the university. So his director was John Young Templeton III. John Young Templeton was a cardiovascular surgeon there. He was well known in the field of cardiovascular surgery. He was the first assistant of John Gibbon for many years and was the first resident researcher on Dr. Gibbon's heart-lung machine. And just as an aside, Dr. Denton Cooley once told Steve Slogoff that the only surgeon he ever considered a technical equal was John Young Templeton III. And that's funny because there was a joke about Dr. Cooley. That was true. At a national meeting sometime, a journalist asked him who the best cardiac surgeon in the world was. And Dr. Cooley said, "Well, I'm the best cardiac surgeon in the world." And he said, "Well, who's the second best then?" And he said, "Me, drunk." So, yeah, don't laugh too soon. Me, drunk was the answer to the second one. So anyway, it's interesting that personally, Dr. Cooley thought that Dr. Templeton was his equal. So Steve, after finishing his fellowship, he owed the U.S. Army 4 years, and he went to San Antonio, to Fort Sam Houston, to Brooke Army Medical Center. And he published a couple of papers while he was there. One was this clinical experience with subanesthetic ketamine, and the other was this ketamine-induced stress ulcers in the rat. And I believe you can see, if you're good, that David Cheney was an author on both of these papers, maybe not on, yeah, he was an author on both of these papers. So Steve Slogoff worked with David Cheney during his time there. When his time in the Army was about to be completed, Steve went and wanted to interview around. And he interviewed at USC, he interviewed at UCLA, he interviewed at UT Southwestern. He interviewed at UT Southwestern because David Cheney had moved there, had been hired there by Pepper Jenkins, the chairman of the department. But Pepper said, you know, I'm not going to let you go. I'm not going to let you come here and work in the burn unit with David Cheney. I want you to do obstetrical anesthesia. And so Steve Slogoff said, no thanks. He interviewed at Baylor College of Medicine. Keats, who obviously was on the editorial board of anesthesiology, mentioned what a cute paper this little ketamine-induced stress ulcer in rats was, but that really started a remainder of their lifelong friendship. He joined Arthur Keats on July 1st, 1974, and if you remember back to the Keats part of the talk, that's the day that Arthur Keats was removed as chair. So that was kind of a shock. So Slogoff visited with Arthur, and Arthur told him, I have two options for you. You can get a job anywhere in the country. I'll make sure that wherever you want to go, they'll hire you. Or you can hang on at Baylor until I have the opportunity to bring you over to Texas Heart Institute. And so that's what he did. He stayed at Baylor College of Medicine until October 1974, when he went to join Arthur. So Arthur was the third of Steve's three mentors. He called him his boss, mentor, and best friend. Steve served also as a director on the American Board of Anesthesiology. He departed Texas Heart Institute in 1993, 2 years after I came on there, to become chair of the Department of Anesthesiology at Loyola, and eventually dean there as well. But what I really wanted to also share with you was what I thought were some important papers that came out with their collaboration. And I'll just do these chronologically. So this one is perioperative propranolol therapy and aortic coronary bypass surgery. And this was in JAMA from September 1978. There were three groups in this paper. Group A was a normal propranolol therapy to the time of surgery. There was a propranolol therapy weaned 24 to 72 hours preoperatively, and there was a no propranolol therapy group. The reason this was important was because some people at that time, it hadn't been decided yet, all the cardiovascular surgeons in here or anesthesiologists in here will recognize it. It hadn't been decided yet that beta blockers were actually good for people with coronary artery disease. And so there was concerns about being able to wean from cardiopulmonary bypass and things like that. So this paper was a stellar paper from that point of view. The outcomes they looked at were myocardial ischemia, so ST segment change or a ventricular arrhythmia, and hypotension or bradycardia or difficulty weaning from cardiopulmonary bypass. And if you look at their results, there was myocardial ischemia in 26% of Group A, so the group that had drugs all the way up to the time of surgery, 70% in Group B, where the drugs were withheld for prior to surgery, and 51% in Group C who had no drugs. And there wasn't any difference in hypotension or bradycardia, no difference in weaning from cardiopulmonary bypass, need for inotropes, or mortality. So it was clear that use of beta blockers preoperatively was safe and helped prevent significant percentage of issues of myocardial ischemia in the operating room. Here's a second one. And this is etiologic factors in neuropsychiatric complications associated with cardiopulmonary bypass from anesthesia and analgesia in 1982. And in this study, they looked at 204 patients who were going to require cardiopulmonary bypass. The incidence and etiology of post-perfusion cerebral dysfunction was measured. Patients were given either sodium thiopental or diazepam during the case. Neurologic exam was done on post-op day 1 and 4, and psychometric tests were done on post-op 4. There were fewer neuropsychiatric complications in the thiopental group, but there wasn't any significant difference. Overall, post-op cerebral dysfunction attributed to cardiopulmonary bypass alone was about 16.2% for transient dysfunction and 6.4% for persistent dysfunction. So that was still present on post-op day 10. This paper brought up the idea that post-op cerebral dysfunction was more than twice as high in intracardiac procedures. So, and that was felt, and it was more than 4 times as high in patients older than 60. So look at us. Anyway, it was felt that Another important thing here, and this is funny because in the Clinical Outcomes Consortium talks this morning, they talk about maintaining blood pressure in patients above 65. And in this paper and in other papers that we published at Texas Heart Institute afterward, perfusion pressures less than 50 with hematocrits less than 30 were not related to postoperative cerebral dysfunction. And so maybe it was because the pump runs were only an hour long and the surgeons were really skilled. The data here, though, suggests, and this was the beginning of the belief, that most of the cerebral dysfunction came from air or particulate emboli, especially with left-sided procedures. A third study was on the safety of radial arterial cannulation, and this one is, again, from Anesthesiology in 1983. And they looked at complications following radial artery cannulation in almost 1,700 patients, and in 83 patients in whom another artery was cannulated after a failed attempt at the radial artery cannulation. And so this was all patients who were going to have extracorporeal circulation. Patients were examined with Doppler studies on day 1 and 7. After decannulation, although partial or complete radial artery occlusion occurred in 25% of patients, there was no ischemic change to the hand or disability that occurred in any patient. Neither duration of cannulation or size of the catheter was a determinant to abnormal flow. And, you know, I think this is interesting because in my practice, ever since I left Texas Heart Institute, we've always used the smallest radial artery catheter we could, a 20 gauge typically. But when I was there working for those 18 years, we were always using 18 gauge catheters for every radial arterial cannulation we did. So it's funny how people feel that they can't do that. Abnormal flow was significantly related to the female gender, the presence of a hematoma, and the use of extracorporeal circulation. So anyway, they said that radial arterial cannulation is a low-risk, high-benefit monitoring technique that deserves wider clinical use in all patients. So finally, here we go. Does perioperative myocardial ischemia lead to postoperative myocardial infarction? And this was a study that was published in Anesthesiology in February of 1985. This was the famous study to determine whether a relationship existed between perioperative myocardial ischemia and postoperative myocardial infarction, including the infamous anesthesiologist number 7. Patients, let's see, so here we go. This study proved the link between perioperative myocardial ischemia and postoperative myocardial infarction. Almost half of ischemia was present when patients actually entered the operating room, and other times where it was important was after induction. It occurred probably almost 20% of the time in patients without any hemodynamic abnormality at all. So again, not necessarily related to hypotension. During anesthesia, ischemia was most frequently associated with tachycardia, not hypertension or hypotension. However, for anesthesiologist number 7's patients, ischemia was associated with tachycardia and hypertension, as well as surgical events known to cause increased sympathetic tone. Overall, most ischemic events occurred during intubation and surgical stimulation. So I kept it to 20, well, actually, like 18 minutes. Does anybody have any questions?
We're going to hold questions and do it.
Oh, that's right. We're going to do questions later. Okay, thanks.
Let's see, we up for good. As you get older, it gets harder to read the, as Dave Barry describes it, the bacterial-sized fonts that everybody seems to want to use. So excuse me there for a moment. Our next speaker is someone that I have not known as long as I've known Marty and Paloma, but she really impressed me one day. We were at a meeting in Virginia, and a very dear friend of both of ours had fallen and was in a considerable amount of pain. And she arranged to get the supplies and fixed him up so that he could be comfortable for a couple of days. But the really thing that impressed me the most was when he wasn't getting better, she pulled the Mama Bear act and got him to go to the ED, where he wound up in the ICU for 3 or 4 days. So she is not only a great historian, but an excellent physician, and it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Amy Woods. And like operating on horseback in a West Texas dust storm, early days of anesthesiology in Dallas and at Parkland Hospital. I cannot wait to hear the rest of it. Without further ado, Amy.
It might have been the subcutaneous emphysema that started me getting concerned that day, but anyway, today I'll be talking about important people and events that occurred in the early days of Parkland Hospital. I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. I do have a disclaimer that I'm a 20-year member of the department that at Southwestern and a faculty, and my clinical site is Parkland Hospital. So my background knowledge and my personal experiences probably influence the content of this talk. Here's my objectives. Because Parkland has been tied to medical education in Dallas for over a century, this talk will actually include a brief history of the medical school as well. So the city of Dallas is actually a pretty young city. In 1850, the population was only about 400 people. This increased rapidly, and the population of Dallas was about 100,000 by 1910. The streets were largely still dirt, and when it rained, it was really hard to get around. Wagons and horses had trouble on the muddy roads. Sanitation was fairly poor. Livestock had been banned from the streets, but milk cows were able to roam freely during the daylight hours, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Dallas built its first city hospital in 1872, and it was in the red light district of Dallas. This was a really rough part of town, and the doctors that visited prominently displayed their doctor bags so that everyone knew their purpose in the area. And clergy would buy a larger than usual Bible and carry that so that they would not get messed with when they were visiting the hospital. The hospital conditions were really, really poor. It flooded when it rained, and there were no bathrooms and only one swinging light to see in the dark. In 1893, Dallas voters approved a $40,000 bond to build the new and modern city hospital that would become known as Parkland. In the bottom left, in the bottom right, sorry, is a advertisement for Parkland Hospital that was in the Texas Health Journal in, I believe it was December 1894. And it's a beautiful advertisement, but the text that went with the advertisement is a little humorous, so bear with me as I read it. The journal desires to again call the attention of the profession of the state to an institution in which all of Dallas takes a very special pride, Parkland Hospital. Institutions of this character are altogether too rare in the West and South. Parkland Hospital is situated in the midst of a most beautiful park in North Dallas at very high altitude with a commanding view of beautiful lakes and cultivated fields. It is supplied with pure artesian water. Every room and ward is supplied with hot and cold water and bathtub. It has a complete and perfect system of electric lights. Every modern surgical and medicinal appliance is included in the armamentarium. The force of nurses is the best paid and the most competent that could be obtained from the training schools of the East. The staff of physicians and surgeons are all men of more than average ability. The private rooms are built with a special reference to light and ventilation and are models for the hospitals of the future. Isn't that great? I just think that's hysterical. The place is beautiful, the land is beautiful, the nurses are great, the doctors are better than average. But you can see that Parkland's always been a source of pride for the city of Dallas. So, doctors in Dallas were not very well educated. In fact, there were few that had formal education at any reputable institutions at all. Basically, all you had to do to practice medicine in Dallas was move to town, register yourself as a health officer, and then start practicing medicine. There were meager requirements. In 1890, Dr. Ramsdale from Lampasas, Texas, quoted to the Texas Medical Association, "The young man who left the plow does not know Greek from Choctaw," indicating that most of the Texas doctors were overall uneducated and that this needed to change. Dr. Charles Rosser was a practicing physician during this time in Dallas. And in his memoirs, he wrote that Dallas physicians were just putting on artificial airs, is what he said. There was a lot of competition for doctors, for patients that could pay. And so to get to be the doctor for a physician that could pay, for a patient that could pay, they put on a beautiful top hat, an elegant coat, they bought a fine horse and a fancy rig, and if they looked the part, they were more likely to get the business of paying customers. And so that is what he meant by artificial airs. Germ theory had not been accepted in Dallas even as late as 1890, even though Lister had done his work, decades prior. So the state of medical care was overall, still very rudimentary. So as far as anesthesia goes, during this time, it was customary for general anesthetics to be administered by medical students, interns, or nurses. There were not many physicians who limited their practice to anesthesiology. Dr. Rufus Wittes is one of the first that we could find documented. He came to Dallas in 1885 and entered into a medical practice with another doctor, Dr. Henry Leake. And shortly after that time, he started advertising himself as the physician in charge of chloroform. And so it appears that he limited his practice to anesthesia somewhere in the late 1880s. And he is our first documented physician anesthesiologist in Dallas. So Dr. Granger Poe was a little bit later than this. He was actually the early 20th century. But I think it's worth mentioning because Dr. Poe wrote the first anesthesia textbook in Texas. That was published in 1926. He actually later published another book as well. Poe gave anesthesia for a surgeon in Dallas from 1915 to 1919, but after that he transitioned to full-time anesthesia practice. He was the first hospital-employed full-time anesthesiologist at Texas Baptist Sanitarium, which would later become Baylor Hospital in Dallas. He designed and patented a few devices, including the Poe insufflating airway, shown here. He also worked with a nurse anesthetist named Pinky Sanders to help design the Sanders apparatus. This machine had 4 channels to allow for mixing of gases, but the problem with the machine is that the flows were notoriously unregulated, causing sometimes toxic administration of anesthetics. But nonetheless, it was popular in Dallas and surrounding areas for about 20 years. Because Parkland and Southwestern are tied so closely in history, I want to talk a little bit about how that relationship happened. In 1900, Dr. Charles Rosser and Dallas Mayor Ben Cabell put an ad. They talked and they decided that Dallas needed a quality medical school. And so the mayor put an ad in the Dallas Morning News on August 15th, 1900, announcing a desire to create a new medical school in Dallas. And this was met with overwhelming opposition by the Dallas medical community. Just a week or so later, another ad was placed by physicians opposed to this idea. And you can see in the top right is a list of all the physicians that signed a petition to say, we don't want a new medical school in Dallas. And it's kind of unclear why there were so many physicians opposed to it. The first idea was that maybe they thought it wasn't going to be a good quality school, so what's the point? The second reason, and probably more likely the cause, was that they didn't want the competition from the graduates of that medical school to come into the community and compete with them for patients. There was a third reason that was put forth, and that was that Dr. Rosser had a generally disagreeable personality, and maybe that had a little bit to do with it as well. Nevertheless, Rosser persisted, and his medical school, the University of Dallas Medical Department, opened later that year. So First Baptist Church of Dallas pastor George Truitt helped the medical school establish a relationship with Baylor University, a Baptist school in Waco, Texas, and the school became Baylor Medical College in 1903. The affiliation was in name only, though. Baylor actually did not financially support the medical school, which was a problem from the beginning, but became a bigger problem over the next 40 years that Baylor was in Dallas. Finding suitable teachers was hard, as was finding an institution in which to train. So again, with help from Truitt, with his influence and connections, they raised the funds to build Texas Baptist Memorial Sanitarium, which opened in 1909 and was the main training facility for the medical school. In 1920, the hospital was renamed to Baylor Hospital, and they made a controversial decision that year. They decided to close the hospital to anyone who was not on the Baylor teaching faculty. And that greatly upset a lot of Dallas physicians. The root of the decision was twofold. They wanted to encourage physicians to join the faculty, and they wanted to improve the overall clinical teaching that was done at the hospital. But since almost 75% of Dallas doctors were not on Baylor faculty, this really only served to renew the antagonism between the medical school and the medical community. Around 1916, an agreement was forged between Baylor and Parkland Hospital. Baylor would provide half of Parkland's staffing needs. The wooden structure that we saw in the ad in a previous slide was replaced by this beautiful red brick building in 1913, thanks to another generous bond approval by Dallas voters. By the 1930s, most Baylor trainees indicated that Parkland was their main training site at that time. This is a picture of the operating room at Parkland sometime around 1952. Dr. Jenkins, in his autobiography, described the scene for us. Great, just wait. Pungent memories of Parkland's operating suite, he said. There were 5 operating rooms on the second floor of Parkland, just above the kitchen, from which the pervasive odors of cabbage cooking often upset the surgeons greatly, causing them to look for unscheduled iatrogenic perforations of the bowel. There was no air conditioning in the operating suite, and large fans with sparking relays sat in an open windows just above a gravel driveway next to the kitchen. The fans blew dust into the ORs and across the non-conductive floors. The primary agents in use were diethyl ether and cyclopropane without the use of muscle relaxants. For good reasons, the surgeons often referred to their experiences as operating on horseback in a West Texas dust storm. In 1939, Dr. Edward H. Carey created the Southwestern Medical Foundation, with its mission being to turn the medical school and Parkland into one of the world's greatest medical centers. However, in 1943, conflict between the Baylor University Board of Regents and the medical school faculty reached a pinnacle. And in an almost overnight decision, or so it seemed to some, Baylor entered into an agreement with the Anderson Foundation. Baylor Medical School, Medical College, entered into an agreement with the Anderson Foundation. As a result, Baylor College of Medicine was moved to Houston. So this left Dr. Carey and his fledgling foundation that he had just established without a medical school to support. Carey committed himself to opening a new school in Dallas. He believed in it. And then later that year, Southwestern Medical School was born. With help from the military, these prefabricated plywood barracks were set up right next to Parkland Hospital. These barracks quickly earned the name the Shacks. Lectures were held in the Shacks and also at a local junior high school, which I thought was interesting. Parkland Board of Directors gave permission for the use of Parkland as a teaching hospital, and so from its very beginning, Parkland was the primary teaching institution for Southwestern students. Parkland has always had a reputation for trauma, and in fact, Parkland had the first ever Level 1 trauma center in Texas. It was this reputation that caught the attention of aspiring surgeon, Dr. Marion T. Pepper Jenkins, and brought him to Dallas. Pepper was described as a man of courage and a risk taker, and it was said that he saw an opportunity at an institution that he felt was destined for greatness. Dr. Jenkins arrived to Parkland Hospital in 1946 to begin his surgery residency. There were no physician anesthesiologists at Parkland, and in fact, there was no teaching of anesthesiology at all at that time. Pepper's attending surgeons, Drs. Carl Moyer and Dr. Lee Hudson, recognized that in order for surgery to progress, that this relationship needed to change. They saw in Pepper a capable and cooperative physician who could train in anesthesiology elsewhere and then come back to Parkland to create an anesthesiology division. In 1946, Pepper left to train with Dr. Henry Beecher at MGH, the same year of the centennial celebration of Ether Day, which I just thought was interesting. Pepper said, "In less than 6 months as an anesthesiology resident, I realized that anesthesia, despite its value for patient comfort and safety, transgressed upon the patient's inherent normal physiology so severely as to have great potential for morbidity and mortality. Also came the realization that medicine needed many more physicians dedicated to teaching anesthesiology." He returned to Dallas in September of 1948, and he became the chief of the anesthesiology division of the Department of Surgery. One of his first orders of business was to create a proper recovery room, which was a relatively new concept. Pepper's memoirs say that the recovery room he set up at Parkland was the first one west of the Mississippi River, but I think we've discovered this might not have been true, but I do think it was the first one in Texas. In 1950, there was another breakthrough. Pepper published an article entitled Congestive Atelectasis, a Complication of the Intravenous Infusion of Fluids. Prior to this, hemorrhagic shock was treated with whole blood and D5 water. Pepper and his colleagues theorized that the fluid component of resuscitation was creating pulmonary congestion, and they proved their theory using anesthetized dogs that were bled into states of shock. They showed that the simultaneous administration of balanced salt solution with whole blood was a far superior treatment for hemorrhagic shock. Remember, Pepper likes salt, he would always say. He had hoped that perhaps revolutionizing fluid therapy would be his legacy. But unfortunately, another event in Parkland's history would overshadow this. So a talk about Parkland is hardly complete without mentioning the event that propelled Parkland onto the world stage, and that was the assassination of John F. Kennedy in November 1963. On that day at approximately 12:38 p.m., JFK was taken into Trauma Room 1, shown here, and by 2 p.m., Jackie, his wife, who insisted on bringing his body home before an autopsy could be done, was escorting his remains to Air Force One. That's how quick it all happened. Parkland, from the time JFK was pronounced dead until the time LBJ was sworn in on Air Force One, Parkland was given a unique distinction as the temporary seat of the executive branch of the United States government. And the state, too, for that matter, as Governor John Conley was also injured that day. As John Conley convalesced in the hospital in the weeks following, he placed a small cardboard sign, seen in the top right, outside of his hospital room that read, "Office of the Governor." I was never around to hear Dr. Jenkins give his account of the day, but I was privileged to hear Dr. Buddy Giesecke tell his story. There's some YouTube videos. Dr. Jenkins' daughter, Christy, has a video on YouTube if you're interested. The chaos of that day and the inconsistencies led to the rise of various conspiracy theories. In 1991, one of the most predominant theories was made into a movie by Oliver Stone called JFK. Well, Dr. Jenkins consulted on that movie to make the hospital scene as realistic as possible. He even got to play himself in the movie. As for whether or not he actually believed in the conspiracies, he did not. He was once quoted as saying, "The movie is great, but it is not a documentary." I'm winding down. This is my last real slide. In 2023, Parkland Hospital delivered almost 13,000 babies, down slightly from its peak of 16,000 babies in 2001. Over the years, Parkland has been a model for prenatal care and dealing with high-risk pregnancies. Dr. Buddy Giesecke, Pepper's eventual successor as chair of the department, was a young faculty member in the 1960s, and Pepper often assigned him to the obstetric service. In an interview in 2011, Buddy said that he felt some of his most important medical contributions came from obstetrical anesthesia. The first was championing the use of an endotracheal tube in cesarean deliveries at Parkland. Believe it or not, cyclopropane under a mask was the common practice at Parkland at that time. Buddy remembered a patient, a young mother that had aspirated and died, and he said this was such a needless death. We ought to be intubating these patients like we do our trauma patients. There was a little bit of opposition to the idea, but the British visiting professors assured everyone that that was pretty routine in the UK at the time to intubate for general cases. The second thing was his articles describing the interaction of magnesium and muscle relaxants. He and his colleague, Dr. Richard Dick Morris, proved that women on magnesium needed much lower infusions of succinylcholine to maintain blockade. And his article published in the Southern Medical Journal was one of the first, if not the first, to report this interaction between magnesium and neuromuscular blockers. A series of articles followed that ultimately defined the nature of this interaction, as well as its antagonism by calcium in feline models. So as I'm close to my time, I just want to take a minute to pay homage to these giants and others that once roamed the halls of Parkland Hospital. I had to focus for such a short time on some things, and I had to leave out a lot of others. So I recognize these people that I didn't get to mention, as well as things like Parkland's Iron Lung Isolation Ward and the Parkland Burn Center and Burn Formula, things like that. But maybe next time, maybe another talk. So this is just the evolution of Parkland over the years. In 2015, we moved into this beautiful new building on the bottom right. And so Parkland's come a long way from the days of operating on horseback in a West Texas dust storm. Thank you for your time.
Amy, thank you for that absolutely fascinating talk. Our final talk, those are your references, correct, Amy? Okay, we gotta make sure I get, yeah, could you? like I say, the bacterial size fonts have gotten me. Good. Our final talk this afternoon will be from Dr. Paloma Toledo, who both of us remember this, that the first time I met her, she was a resident at the resident section, and I was a junior faculty member. So our friendship goes back a long way, and interestingly, she is a master of obstetrical anesthesia. I have avoided obstetrical anesthesia like the plague. So we've never really interacted until the 100th anniversary of ANA, when I asked her if she would be interested in helping write a series of the major contributions of obstetrical anesthesia through anesthesia and analgesia in the last 100 years. And she said, wow, that sounds like fun. So I'm already worried about her because she thinks that that was fun. But later we asked her if she'd be interested in talking about Manny Papper, because she is at the University of Florida, where she is a professor, and the chair is the Emanuel Papper Professor. And she goes, I really don't know that much about Manny Papper. So then we really challenged her by saying, sum up Manny's career in 20 minutes. So without further ado, Paloma Toledo.
So thank you all. I'm really excited to talk about Manny Papper. And I have to say, this is the first time in my life that I've ever done a history presentation. So please bear with me. Thank you to Doug and Melissa. You both are dear friends, and I appreciate the opportunity and the advice that you guys have given me in getting ready for this. So I have no financial disclosures, and I think that we are running a little behind time, so I'll try to keep us on time so that there's time for questions. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Manny Papper, and this is a picture of him through the years. And I'm really going to focus the talk on why he is what I'm calling the Iron Arrow. So there's so much that one could say about him. He was one of the founders of anesthesiology, and he really made such a big impact in so many ways in our specialty that there isn't enough time to really give all aspects of his life in detail. So I'm going to talk to you about him today, and I'm going to summarize key elements of his life, and I'm going to focus it on life lessons that he learned and what I think might be most interesting to our audience today. So the Iron Arrow Society is, at the University of Miami, the highest honor that one can achieve. So here's a picture of the Iron Arrow, and the quote is, "He who would know the arrow must, as an irrefutable rule, have openly and without thought of reward shown obvious love for alma mater." And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about how Manny Papper loved the University of Miami, but also how he loved anesthesiology and really shaped modern anesthesia as we know it. So this past year was the centennial of the University of Miami, and you can see it on the left as it was in 1925 when it was founded, and on the right is a picture of University of Miami today. And the university really has transformed the lives of many students and faculty and really innovated in the last 100 years. So one of my medical students, Giselle, actually was on the Centennial Committee, and I think it's a really interesting time to reflect on how far we've come. So as Dr. Bacon said, when I looked at the last 100 years of obstetric anesthesia and how much things have changed, it really, 100 years goes fast, but really so much can happen in that time. So the Iron Arrow is the honor society. It really was founded in the first 6 months alongside the founding of the university. And so it's really meant to honor those who dedicate themselves to the university. So as I said, I'm going to talk about the life of Manny Papper through several of the lessons that he learned over time. So the first lesson that I want to talk about is how precision really matters. So many of you know Manny Papper was an outstanding scientist. He published over 300 papers in his lifetime. And he was born in New York to immigrant family, and he grew up in Harlem. But when he was born, the person who delivered him didn't fill out a birth certificate for him for weeks. And so Manny was unaware of this until he was a teenager, and as the mother of a 16-year-old, one of the most important events in a teenager's life is the day they can go and get their driver's license. So he goes to get his driver's license, and he's told that he cannot get his driver's license on his birthday because his birth certificate said that he was born weeks later. And so that was one of the first time that Manny realized that precision really does matter. I can only imagine the frustration in a teenager's face at the DMV when you're told you cannot get your driver's license. So the next is you really need to embrace change and new opportunities. And I think this is really interesting because when you think about how life takes several turns, Manny's life was definitely one that had he gone down his original path, he would not be in anesthesiology. So he was born and raised in New York, as I mentioned. He got his undergraduate degree from Columbia College in 1935, obviously was an outstanding student. He was Phi Beta Kappa. And then he did his medical training at NYU and graduated in the late 1930s. So as we heard at the opening session, Bellevue Hospital was really the place where anesthesiology was happening in the late 1930s. So he went to Bellevue Hospital in 1939 for an internship, and he was not intending to do anesthesiology. He did a rotation in anesthesiology only because one of the surgical house officers who was supposed to do anesthesiology, he contracted tuberculosis, and so Papper was sent in as a substitute. So he did an anesthesia rotation. And that really changed his life because the next lesson that I think really you can take away from his life is great mentors are worth following. So Emory Rovenstein was the chairman of anesthesiology at NYU, and he really was an expert teacher. He believed that excellent science was a requirement to improve patient care. And Papper was really influenced by Rovenstein, and he felt the importance of anesthesiology in the operating room, and he saw the opportunity for doing research. So following his internship, he then went and did a fellowship in renal physiology in 1940, and then from 1940 to 1942, he went back to train in anesthesiology. So that's really the change of events of one house officer getting tuberculosis, which brought him to anesthesiology and let him meet his great mentor. Now, the next life lesson that we learn is sometimes great good can come out of great evil. So World War II happens. And if you think about it, halogenated agents that we use today were made possible from the research that was done in developing the atomic bomb. So obviously out of something that was so devastating came something that really impacts the care that we give today. But Manny Papper served from 1942 to 1946 as a major in the Army Medical Corps, and he was involved in helping train the 90-day miracle. So again, there was such bad mortality. Rovenstein and many of the true anesthesiologists at the time, of which there were not many, felt that it was their job to help reduce mortality by training others to be able to give safe anesthesia care. So he served in the military, and there's many great stories of his time in the military, including studying stress and jumping out of a airplane and then having to escape through enemy territory. So were there more time, we could talk a little bit more. But following his duty in Europe, he comes back and he becomes the chief of anesthesiology at Walter Reed Hospital. And, in this time, anesthesia was not something that people wanted to do. And he felt that anesthesia, this is one of the quotes, it's not a handmaiden for a surgeon or a technical support exercise, but a specialty that deserved physicians of major skills. So when I go back to the next slide, great mentors really are worth following. So he goes back to NYU in 1946, and he becomes Dr. Rovenstein's first assistant. And so, like my mentor, Cindy Wong, who I wrote the 100-year article with, he managed to, in 3 years, write 16 articles in some of the most impactful journals in our specialty. So he published in JAMA on graduate education in anesthesiology. And just to give you guys a sense for where we are, so this is the Aqua alumni tree. And if you look at the quote on the tree, it says, to teach doctors to go out and teach other doctors. And you can see here on the lowest branch, you see Dr. Rovenstein, and then you can see Dr. Papper coming off right here. So he really felt a need to train good doctors and to raise the standards of the entire profession. So the next lesson that I think was important in his life is that you have to learn how to lead. So in 1949, he accepted the directorship of anesthesiology at Columbia University, and he had a really good partner in the chair of surgery there because the chair of surgery felt that anesthesiology needed to have a strong clinical competency and a strong academic and research mission. And I think this is really important when you think back at the beginning of our specialty, because until anesthesiology was really part of the university environment, it wasn't getting the respect that a lot of other departments had. So in 1952, Columbia created the first Department of Anesthesiology, putting it on equal footing with surgery and the other medical disciplines. And so Papper really helped collaborate with the basic science departments because he did have a love for research, and he thought that we needed to marry the basic science with the clinical science. And he was really transformative. He created subspecialty divisions in obstetric anesthesia, pediatrics, neurosurgery, and he did something at the time that even medical schools today don't necessarily do. He made sure that every medical student at Columbia University had to rotate in anesthesiology and get that exposure. So he was really committed to developing future leaders in anesthesiology. And when you think about it, to achieve excellence, you really must educate. So you can be a great anesthesiologist, but if you cannot teach your trainees to be great, it's lost. And so he really did spend a lot of time focusing on how do we educate the next generation of anesthesiologists and physician anesthesiologists. So, you know, some of the quotes from his life were, time spent in school is relatively short compared to the time you spend learning thereafter, and you have to learn all of your life. So what happens is you have to learn to enjoy the creativity of the learning process. So the next major lesson in his life that I think is important for us is sometimes you have to be willing to move. So he had spent 20 years of his life at Columbia, and he felt that his mission was complete. He developed his department was the 4th department of anesthesiology in the entire country. He had a great faculty, did a lot of research, very impactful. But after 20 years at Columbia, he had the opportunity to move to a new place, so he came to the University of Miami, and he was offered the deanship at UM at the age of 53. And so yesterday at dinner, we were talking about how it seems so young, but he had already had a very accomplished career at this point. And he did make a significant impact at UM. So he took this nascent school and he increased research funding by 70%. And UM at that time was one of the top 20 in the nation for NIH funding. So during his deanship, he did many things that really left an incredible footprint at the University of Miami. So there was a physical expansion, there was an academic expansion. The University of Miami and Jackson Memorial Hospital are the largest public hospital in the United States and trains some of the most anesthesiology trainees in the country right now. And he helped develop, he was an innovator. He developed a simulation lab. He developed Harvey, which is used for cardiac training. So he really did make an impact on the university. In addition to our specialty, he helped co-found the AUA. And so I think the other thing that's important is he was so dedicated to research that he thought you had to create the infrastructure. So, you know, it's funny, we, in the last 2 years, just wrote the anesthesiology physician scientist pipeline, the Anesthesia Research Council recommendations for where do we go to develop the next generation of physician scientists. And in doing the research for this talk, I realized that Manny Papper, many years ago, said the same thing. So number one, you need to educate individuals dedicated to research. You need to create the appropriate environment. You need to send promising research-oriented people to get a year or two of experience in research. And you really have to advocate for funding for anesthesiology. Which brings me to the next point, which is sometimes you really need to create the infrastructure you want to get the results that you need. So the woman that you see here in the photo is Mary Lasker, and Papper had a way of finding very wealthy donors and cultivating relationships. And so she was from a very wealthy family, and he was talking to her about money and anesthesiology research, and she told him, if you really want to make a difference, you need to go to the government. You need to advocate at the NIH level. So once again, he was willing to move. So he goes and he moves to Washington, D.C. for a year. And he takes a sabbatical in Washington, D.C. And here again, he was very impactful. He helped develop the idea for a Research Career Development Award for NIGMS. He lobbied for increased funding for anesthesia research funding. And so you can see that really there was a lot that came out of the time he spent in Washington, D.C. and advocating for our specialty and the future of our specialty. So it brings us back to the Iron Arrow. So Manny Papper died in 2002, and just before his death, he was inducted into the Iron Arrow Honor Society at the University of Miami. And so to be an Iron Arrow, you need to have a love of alma mater, character, leadership, scholarship, and humility. And clearly, he had all of these things. So I think this is one of the most beautiful quotes from his life. So I believe the best is yet to come, and our present knowledge is trivial when it's compared to what we're going to discover in the future. So it's as true then as it was now. And again, I will thank you guys and leave time for questions. Thank you.
I would invite the three speakers to come up, and we are now open for questions that you might have.
Marty, I've heard a story that perhaps you can verify or not, that when Dr. Jenkins was called to the ER at Parkland for President Kennedy, he had to call your father in the operating room to take an EKG machine to the ER. Is that correct?
No, that's not correct.
Okay.
Let me tell you the actual part of the story. So Dr. Jenkins and Dr. Giesecke and Dr. Hunt were eating lunch in the Parkland cafeteria. And over the loudspeaker, they heard a call for Dr. Shires to go to the emergency room. And that was strange because Dr. Shires, they knew, was in Galveston at a meeting.
Out of town.
And he was out of town. He was the chairman of the Department of Surgery, and there was no way that anyone would call the chairman of the Department of Surgery to the ER because it was run by residents. And so he said, And there was also a couple of surgery residents at a table right next to him. One of them got up and called the hospital operator to see what was going on, found out that the president had been shot and was on the way in. So Pepper Jenkins immediately went to the operating room, but from there he told my dad and Dr. Hunt to bring an EKG machine because they didn't have an EKG machine in the emergency room, and to bring an anesthesia machine because the ventilator that was on the wall in the emergency room, he didn't think he would be able to use properly to help resuscitate if necessary. So your story is partially true, but there is what my father told me. So.
And a great story it is. Thank you.
Along with great stories, I had the opportunity once to sit in Manny Papper's office. I was visiting professor at Miami, and the decision was made that he was going to entertain me for lunch because I don't think they had anybody else. And I sat in his office for an hour. It was fabulous. And I asked him the question, in 1940, you were given curare by, Lewis Wright. And your lab said, oh, this is worthless. And he goes, science is ready for the prepared mind. He goes, we were using cats. They all stopped breathing. We couldn't figure out how you could possibly use this in anesthesia and said it was an absolutely worthless drug. He goes, boy, were we wrong.
Thank you to all three of you for excellent talks. And I think everyone alluded to the fact that there were stories left on the table that they wish they could tell, that if they had more time. So I invite any of you to share an extra story if you'd like.
Everybody's looking at me.
You are the senior member of the panel.
I am the senior member of the panel. So I love Jim Ahrens, and Mary Dale, you know that, and most people know that. He trained me. He gave me my first job as an anesthesiology resident. Actually, he gave me my first job as an anesthesia student working nights in the Department of Anesthesiology at UTMB. Anyway, he was certainly a taskmaster, and I remember as a resident we were told, he once said at one of our grand rounds or something. He says, if you ever have to call in sick, I better hear them reading off your blood gases in the background. And so I was really scared because I had to call in sick a day before going into work because I had influenza really bad. I mean, I was really sick, and one of my chiefs on my medicine rotations as an intern told me, you know, you can't go to work, you'll get everybody sick. And so, and I was really ill, and so I was calling in to tell them that I wasn't going to be at work tomorrow, and I was really worried about keeping my job, but luckily it worked out.
I alluded to the fact that there were a lot of people that I didn't get to include. One of those that I chose to leave out, my original talk was about 3 times longer. But one of the people that I chose to leave out was the influence of C. Ron Stevens during his short time between the time he was at Duke and the time that he went to Wash U. He came down to work with Pepper at Southwestern for a while. It was just a few years, but it was an important couple of years. Children's Hospital was being built, and Stevens basically ushered the department into moving into this new children's hospital. And I thought it was interesting as I was looking at personalities and things that have happened in our department. You know, Stevens was known for the introduction of halothane into practice. And while he was at Southwestern, there was another resident/young faculty during that time named Burnell Brown. Burnell Brown elucidated the mechanism behind halothane hepatitis, and later went on to be chair at Arizona, and later introduced sevoflurane into practice. And so I thought their intersection during that short time in Dallas was just kind of an interesting thing. I left it out because Stevens was mostly at Children's and not Parkland, but thanks for asking.
So Marty, you know, I remember rotating at Texas Heart Institute, and so I think there were certain residents that did rotate there, and it was an interesting place, as you alluded to, because it was a private practice, but yet there was this academic stuff going on, right? But I think they really did instill efficiency there. I mean, it was a machine. You know, they had, if I recall, 10 operating rooms, and we would have 4 to 6 open hearts per day per room that you did. And they did not stop for anything. If you were not efficient at putting a central line in, and it was what we call the old pig stickers, you just, you know, and put it on a water manometer, you would be doing it under the drapes because the nurses didn't stop. They kept prepping, draping. You taped it with masking tape. You know, I mean, it was, you know, of course, they all came out in a day, so I don't think there was that much more infection rate, but they would literally bring over planes of people from Europe for their cabbage operations, and you would have this machine. And then when you took call at night, it was the anesthesia resident and the surgery resident. That was all there was, with a 40-bed post-op unit. And your job was to extubate and get as many people out of there that night as you could for the 40 people coming in the next day. And you learned to be really efficient. You learned to triage. Occasionally I was on with a resident that was stupid, you know, a surgery resident. And I would tell him that this was cardiac tamponade and needed to open the chest. He's not doing anything, so I'd do it myself, you know, that kind of stuff. But you learned a lot. You learned to be really efficient with, you know, the amount of work you did. And you were on call for all the ICUs of 9 floors. So, you know, in 2 months, you were doing 150 hearts plus all the post-op care. Anyway, it was interesting back then, and I think they were prolific in their research because they had such a volume of patients, And yes, we all worked with anesthesiologist number 7, but a lot of us would slip in other drugs to ameliorate things.
I just wanted to say that I love history. Thank you all very much for 3 very entertaining discussions. I'm Peggy Wilson. I trained at Parkland with Dr. Jenkins. And Marty, when you were talking about reasons not to come in, one of his favorite sayings was, "A death in the family is no excuse unless it's your own." and the other thing he said is, if you feel sick, you come into work, we're doctors, we'll tell you whether you can whether you can go home or not.
Are there any other questions or comments? Paloma, do you have a last story to kind of end all of this?
Well, I guess the one story that I thought was really interesting is just the political insight that Manny Papper had. So when he was at the NIH for that year, he wanted to accomplish the goal of getting more funding for research and training in anesthesiology. But Papper was a Democrat, and he knew that he had to work across the aisle in order to get this done. So Robert Drips apparently was a fervent Republican, so he and Drips worked together to make sure that they were able to cover all the bases so that they would have the political support to get the legislation through that is now the funding for the NIGMS training awards that many of the anesthesia junior faculty get when they get their Ks and T32s from NIGMS. So I thought that was really insightful and interesting. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for your kind attendance, and thank our speakers.